Hello everyone. This is Martin Lush from NSF Health Sciences in the UK. Very good morning to our colleagues in Mexico, USA and Canada who have got up very early to listen to this webinar. Good afternoon to all of you in Central Europe, and a good evening to those of you calling in from Singapore, India and South Korea. So, a real mix of audience, everyone. Thanks ever so much for your time. Let's hope, well, certainly it's going to be value-adding. So, this, ladies and gentlemen, is the third of our free webinar program for 2015. Many of you listened in January on our session on human reliability. Most of you, again, February on improving CAPA effectiveness and reducing repeat deviations, all of which went very well, and thanks ever so much for your very positive feedback, which brings us to what we're covering in March, which is how to change quality habits in culture. These sessions have been extremely popular, which is great, because this is... Can everybody hear me? Because I just had a note from Andy saying no sounds, Martin. Just if one of you could just confirm that. Yeah, thanks, Joanna. You can. Sorry, Andy. I'm not sure what's wrong your end. But anyway, you can see from the program what is going forward. Now, one important note is that we've actually introduced more places to these webinars. They filled up very, very quickly. We extended the number of places available, so please, if you or your colleagues have been unsuccessful in booking on any of the future ones, then please try again, because we've extended that coverage. So, some interesting facts, ladies and gentlemen, on the subject of quality habits and quality culture. We've been in the consultancy business a good number of years, and we constantly are being asked the question, how do we, the clients, change our quality culture? In fact, that's the wrong question, because what we've got to be asking is, how do we change our quality habits? Because you can't change culture without changing people first. And, what I implore anybody I certainly talk with is to stop talking about culture change and start talking about how to change quality habits, which is the subject of our discussion today. It's also linked, guys, to our May webinar, which is how to change habits in the workplace. So we're going to get into more specifics then and there. As always, afterwards, this webinar is going to be available for you to download. We're recording this as we go along, so this gives you the opportunity of sharing it with colleagues. Now, I was at a conference a few years ago when Janet Woodcock, Director of FDA, made it very clear to us in the pharmaceutical industry that we needed to change. And I'm not going to go through this verbatim, but you can see her emphasis really on getting us, the industry, to adapt and to change was really, really important. Now, one hot topic that I'm sure you're all aware of, it's certainly in everything I read at the moment, is this hot topic of data integrity. And I get actually quite frustrated when people start analyzing, the system reasons and why it's happening and how to find it, rather than actually looking at the behaviours, the underpinning reasons why we supposedly have such a big issue with data integrity. Because actually when you start looking at that, as we've done as an organisation, certainly over the last 12 to 18 months, you start to see that often it's system complexity, often it's down to excessive change, often it's down to lack of understanding, that is the why that underpins the how, often it's down to poor training and education, but fundamentally down to poor quality habits. For those of you who don't know me, very quickly, I've been in the industry a good number of years. My speciality is, if I have one, is of sterile products, really across the product life cycle from research all the way through to commercialization, manufacturing and distribution. I've also spent a lot of time, ladies and gentlemen, in automobiles, microelectronics and other industries, and also work very closely with our colleagues at York University, particularly, I guess, to feed my passion for understanding human behaviour, because I guess really at heart I'm a frustrated psychologist, because really what does fascinate me is what and why, what drives behaviours, and what we do with that information to prevent those behaviours from being replicated. Let's start off with a quiz. Just go through this mentally, ladies and gentlemen, a simple yes or no. First question, most New Year's resolutions fail within days. Well, the answer to that is yes. When you change or modify an old SOP, users will follow the old one automatically. That is absolutely right. So just remember that when you change or modify a documentation at a neurological, psychological level, the operators don't have a choice. They follow the old one, not the new one you've modified. So don't be surprised when you start to see errors and mistakes as a result. Third question, 75% of behaviors are subconscious. Yes. Next question, impossible to break old habits? Actually, it is impossible to break old habits. We'll talk later about how you replace old habits with new habits that are stronger. That's certainly possible. It takes a huge amount of effort, but if we want to change behavior, we need to replace the old habits with new ones, and we'll look at the process of doing that. Next question there, 45% of decisions are habitual or made subconsciously without thinking. The answer is yes. Next question, great products, great processes are designed for the habitual mind. The answer is yes. You need go no further than to look at Apple's products, whether it be the iPad, the iPhone. They have been very, very carefully designed for the habitual mind. And this is something that we in the pharma industry need to be aware of when we're writing procedures, when we're designing our processes, to ask the question, are we designing something that the brain can habituate with ease, as is the case with iPads and iPhones, all of which we're very familiar with, or are we actually designing a process that is actually almost impossible to habituate? And that's certainly what I see. And last question there, guys. Without habits, which we're going to describe later, we wouldn't survive. And the answer to that question is yes. One of the purposes of habits, that is the ability to act without conscious thought, is to actually free up our valuable thinking resources for the really, really important tasks and challenges, often of which we meet first time round, that really do need considered thought. So habits are good and bad in equal measure, but very, very very difficult to actually challenge and change once we've got them. Now, this is a very simplified diagram, ladies and gentlemen. It's got to be simple for me to understand it, frankly, but this is a simplified diagram of what is a habit. Now, the top two pictures there, these represent two neurons communicating with each other. Now, looking at the top two pictures there, this represents your first driving lesson, which was very slow, very clunky, probably a little bit dangerous as well. And this is where, whenever we're exposed to a new task, the process of communication, the red lines between these neurons, is very, very slow. Because as you biologists and pharmacists and the like will understand and know, is that the messages between the brain cells are communicated through what we call neurotransmitters. And for a new discipline, a new practice, the brain cells are actually quite a distance apart. And therefore, it feels slow and it feels very, very clunky. Now, the two pictures at the bottom represent your brain cells now when it comes to driving. In other words, through practice and practice and practice and practice and practice, you are now subconsciously competent. In other words, those actions are fast and furious, and you can now drive to work, having navigated I don't know, 1.5 hours worth of journey, traffic, road disruption, probably some of you on your mobile phone, those of you not listening to a book on the radio, and you all then arrive at your car parking bay, and you say to yourself, oh, I'm here. In other words, you've had no conscious thought about the process because it has been automatic. And that is when a habit is formed. That is when you act without conscious thought. Now, the brain is a fascinating structure. All I want to do here is to illustrate, ladies and gentlemen, where habits are formed and where habits are found. And this really is in the cerebellum, as well as also in the limbic system. Now, these are two areas of the brain that are, from an evolutionary perspective, very, very old. And this is why habits are very deep-rooted and are challenging to actually change. So, if you look at habits from a pictorial sense, you know, a habit is that path the brain takes automatically. It's a slightly more sophisticated drawing, a picture on the right-hand side there, ladies and gentlemen, of the process by which the neurotransmitters send a signal across to the receptor cells in the brain to therefore communicate the action or the behavior that is actually required. And with practice and practice and practice, these neurons don't actually physically touch, but the cells at the surface of the dendrites actually do change to make them more reactive and more sensitive. And the process the brain goes through when faced with a decision, when faced with a situation, is to ask itself the question, have I seen this before? In other words, is there a path I can take automatically? Or do I have to consciously think about this? And for the purpose of saving time, thinking, and energy, the brain will always default to a habit that it thinks is relevant and actually appropriate. So that's what we mean by a habit. Now let's just start with a story, ladies and gentlemen, just to bring us to what we're here to discuss, which is quality habits. How do we influence behaviors in the workplace? Now, a few months ago, my wife purchased a MacBook. We were then, a few days later, contacted by our bank because this was an unusual purchase. You know, we don't often go out spending that type of money. So, you know, quite pleased that the bank recognized this and flagged it up to say, is this your purchase? Now, much to my wife's infuriation, they refused to talk to her. They only wanted to talk to me, who frankly knows nothing about his household finance accounts. But they asked me to phone ASAP, otherwise our credit card would stop. So anyway, I eventually phoned. I was told by somebody at the end of the phone that, Mr. Lush, everything is okay, you're good to go. Well, 24 hours later, my card was stopped, which is a bit embarrassing when you're standing ready to check out at a hotel, only to see your card payment refused. So I instantly got back onto the credit card company, one of the top 3 in the UK. Managed to talk to somebody eventually. Guess what? No records of the discussion I had previously saying my card was fine. I then had a 2-hour phone call with lots of lovely music in between, cut off twice, being constantly told by this recorded message that my service and loyalty was appreciated, until eventually I got through to somebody who said, well, Mr. Lush, yeah, we'll send you a form to fill in order to fix this. Now, is that a healthy quality culture? Are those quality habits that would bring me back to that credit card company and recommend them to others? Absolutely not. Contrast that experience with this one. We've worked very closely with quality professionals in the automobile industry because they are the experts in quality. not the only experts, but they're certainly not in the pharmaceutical industry at this moment in time. And I was talking to this engineer who had been on a training assignment in Japan, and he was standing on the end of a production line from which these brand new shiny cars were coming off at 2 o'clock in the morning. He inadvertently turns very, very quickly, and in doing so scratches one of these very shiny, very expensive cars with a wrench or spanner, a tool, in other words, that had been put in his pocket. His first reaction, he said, was, Martin, first thing I asked myself was, did anybody see me? And then he corrected himself and said, look, my training and the quality culture within this particular company drove him to pull what is known in the automobile industry as the andon cord. And this is literally, if not a cord, but a button that when there is a quality incident, you push that button, the alarms sound, the lights flash, and a problem-solving team arrives very, very quickly. Now, what surprised him was very quickly they started to congratulate him, which he felt was rather strange because this guy came from a westernized culture. Within 24 hours, that factory had Teflon coated all of the tools within 24 hours. So the quality culture in that particular factory was one of every incident is a learning opportunity that can be used to improve the process, which was exactly what they did through their very timely execution of that Teflon coating. Now, that is what we mean by quality habits. Habits, that are what people do automatically without thinking. Just another couple of examples, ladies and gentlemen, because these to me really communicate the difference between a good quality culture, a healthy quality culture, and one that is quite damaging. For example, the one on the left-hand side, I was at a client a few years ago doing an audit of their QC lab, and I was sat outside writing up my audit notes, sat on a bench, looking up at damaged ceiling tiles, damaged wall with exposed plaster, and everybody walking past them, including QA, including management. And I felt like saying to them, guys, am I the only one seeing this? Why don't you fix it? Well, clearly they just got used to seeing that type of poor housekeeping, which actually was reflected in the quality of their documentation, their attitude towards GCLPs, their attitude towards good manufacturing practices across the facility. Contrast that, ladies and gentlemen, with the example on the right. Again, I was at a contract manufacturer a few years ago. It was fairly late on. It was about 9 o'clock in the evening, and I was walking down this very, very long corridor, returning to the office to pick up things before leaving. And this guy walks out in front of me. He didn't see me. He comes out from a door on the left-hand side. He's walking along the corridor without me knowing that I was there. And he picked up this piece of litter, actually walked across the floor to pick up this piece of litter that was not theirs, but not his, but he instinctively bent down, picked it up, and put it in the trash can as soon as he saw it. So, that is a quality culture that is healthy. And when we talk about quality habits, that is what people do instinctively. It's really the difference that makes the difference. It's the difference between those companies that will survive no matter what and prosper no matter what the external environment is like, whereas those that don't have the right quality habits will not. And the way I view quality habits, and we're going to explore a few more later, ladies and gentlemen, with some specific examples at the end regarding habits relating to documentation. So this is really the big picture stuff first, because these habits, what people do instinctively no matter what, these are our true north. These are the things that keep us heading in the right direction no matter how bad the weather is or the external environment. They're enduring. The environment may change, and you can bet that is going to be the case. You can certainly bet your circumstances may change. But these quality habits do not. And really success, I always believe, is actually about doing the basics better than anybody else. And there's a lovely quote here that emphasizes that. Extraordinary companies don't do extraordinary things. They just do the ordinary things to an extraordinary level. What that really means is that to really excel, we just got to do the basics very, very well, better than anybody else, and our future is ensured. And quality culture in any organization, I think, can only be measured by the things people do when no one is watching. What that operator is doing in that grade B at 2 o'clock in the morning when nobody's looking at the video, when there's no supervision, when that operator drops a pair of forceps on the floor, you hope to God that he leaves them there or she leaves them there. She kicks them to the side of the room and gets out another sterilized pair rather than picking them up. So quality culture is measured by that guy in the corridor at 9 o'clock at night, seeing a piece of litter, not thinking, that's not mine, therefore I won't pick it up, but they instinctively pick it up. So Aristotle had a wonderful quote when it came to quality that I often use. Quality is not an act, it is a habit. And as we've already explored, a habit is something that we do without thinking, no matter what. And when we come to building a strong quality culture, that can only ever be achieved by everybody adopting the right quality habits. So if you go all the way back to that, I think, third slide, ladies and gentlemen, with Janet Woodcock, saying, look, you, the industry, you need to change. You need to change your quality culture and your approach to quality risk management. Q9 has been around for almost a decade, and yet very few companies are using it in the way that it should be used. Q10 has been around for not quite as long, but certainly 7 or 8 years, and yet I can count on one hand the number of companies who are applying Q10 properly. So what Janet Woodcock is saying is, look, if you want to change your quality culture, you better do it quick. And what I'm saying is absolutely, but you've got to focus on individual behaviors in the first instance. Now, my objectives in this session, and we'll certainly go for no more than 55 minutes, ladies and gentlemen, because that's about the maximum you can ever listen to me in one go, be assured. My personal objectives for you is for each of you to understand what we mean by creating one strong quality culture, to actually identify the quality habits that we've got to go about practicing, our top 5, if you like, how these can be reinforced, what you will individually do differently. This is a question I'm going to leave you with. And to really just say, look, we're all in this together because we all have a vested interest in doing this and doing this well. And win or lose in this very competitive, very turbulent environment that is going to be with us for a good number of years, if not forever, is actually based upon individuals' quality habits. Now, guys, there is a question option through the chat feature on ReadyTalk. Please send in your questions. Unfortunately, I'm really bad at trying to present and answer the questions within a very confined period. So what I'm going to do, guys, when questions come in, I'm going to try and address them as best I can. But one thing I will promise you is that I will keep those questions and I will post the responses to those questions alongside the recording of the webinar when you actually download it. So if you were to conduct an open book audit of the examples that I've given you, the bank who didn't care, frankly, and the engineer you did, what do you think you would find? Because the reason for posing this question is that when you see behaviors both that are reflective of a great quality culture, but also of a quality culture that is not fit for purpose, you've got to understand the reasons why, and you've got to dig a little deeper. Now, I actually I got in contact with this particular bank, and I said, look, can I come along and talk to your people? Because this is your customer giving you some really important feedback. And to my surprise, I have to say, they said, come on in. So I did, and this is what I found. I found I mean, I could never do it. These guys in the call center, minimal training, poorly played, what we call a 0 hours contract in the UK, all of which were short term. They were all numbers driven. They were all told it's not sales, but it's not about sales, it's about service. They all had a script to follow. They all just followed the rules. There was no empowerment, no loyalty, no connection with the end user, no quality habits. None of which, I hasten to add, was their fault, because actually these were, when you talk to them, very intelligent people just wanting to be guided and wanting to be motivated, but the system's preventing from them doing that. Now, if you contrast that with the engineer, with the contractor that I was referring to, this is what I find. You find happy people, and this is, as I go down this list, ladies and gentlemen, just say yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, in relation to your organization. Do you have happy people? Are they passionate, engaged, informed, and empowered? Is everybody, and I do mean everybody from the top to the shop floor, patient focus? Are deviations and problems seen as good? Is the focus on prevention rather than reaction? Do you have no QA building? Why would you want a QA building? Because the job of QA is to actually be on the shop floor alongside those making the product, influencing and improving, not stuck in an office. No silos. Do you have great teamwork? Do you have a focus on helping manufacturing to do their job as simply and effectively and as quickly and to the best of their abilities? Do you focus on simplification and simplicity? And this is a subject for a later webinar in the year, the science of simplification, because this is one of those basics you have got to do extremely well. If you cannot simplify your systems, you will not stay in business. Do you have openness and transparency in a blame-free culture where everyone has a voice, where problems are brought to the surface, where you have full engagement of the workforce to bring their ideas and their solutions? Is the office seen as the shop floor? In other words, the focus is on manufacturing and on where the action is rather than in meetings or dealing with lots of emails. Do you talk about continuous quality improvement rather than compliance? And is education seen as a profit generator or just a compliance cost? Now, if your answer to all of those, or at least the majority of those, ladies and gentlemen, is yes, 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 then you have a winning quality culture. If you have a lot of no's sprinkled amongst those, then this is when we need to take action. This is when we need to close the gap. Now, most companies have their vision, mission, and values that, frankly, certainly for me, send me to sleep. Most have quality performance objectives, but very, very few successfully turn either of these into enduring quality habits. Now, quality habits, let's just talk big picture first. There are certain steps that we need to go through to establish and ingrain a quality habit. Step one is actually giving a reason for people to care, a connection with what they are doing on a daily basis with the end user. Because as human beings, we're actually quite simple people, and these are the questions we're asking in our mind each day is, why should I bother? What's in it for me? Now, unfortunately, most education programs that I see do not create that emotional and personal connection to the end user. So without that connection, without that big picture that conveys the why should I bother, why should I care, it means that their day-to-day habits are often not the right ones. So step one is about creating the reason for caring. Step two is building, and you can see step 2, step 3, step 4. This is what we know as the habit loop. For every habit or behavior, there is a cue, a prompt or a reminder. That's then followed by the routine, which is doing the job, which is then followed by the reward, which, if it's appropriate, strengthens the quality habit. So this is what is known as the habit loop. There's been a huge amount of research done on how habits are formed and how they are triggered, in other words, the cue, the routine, and the reward. And I'm going to come back to this as we go through the session, ladies and gentlemen, because when we want to change a habit, we have to either change the cue, the routine, or the reward. So, my challenge to you, we're not going to have time to do it, but please do it after the session, is to grab a load of Post-its with your colleagues, go into a room and actually come out with a compelling vision that will engage and resonate with everyone. And this is what I call your elevator conversation, that conveys to people throughout the organization why the hell they should bother, the what's in it for them. And then from that, identify your top 5 quality habits. Now, when people say to me, well, Martin, what's your compelling vision? What do you think the big picture should look like? Now, I know this doesn't look particularly emotional or personal, but just bear with me on this one. Every company that will be in business in 5-8 years' time will be doing this, because our ultimate objective is to balance 3 components of our business in the Venn diagram. Top left, to balance profit and efficiency through cost control alongside our legacy and our reputation, that is our license to operate, alongside our service to the customer. Now, the best in the world companies are those that are constantly rebalancing to ensure that these 3 circles in this Venn diagram are equal. If you focus purely on cost control, you'll go out of business. If you focus purely on compliance, license to operate, paradoxically, you will go out of business, because your operating costs and complexity unfortunately increase. If you focus just on customer service, you'll go out of business. So the job of leadership is to ensure that this balance is maintained. And for me, trying to get across that message to people is really key, and using that diagram is very useful in conveying what we're here to do, particularly with senior leadership. And the box within which these 3 circles are contained represents resource and time. And that box is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. Now, it all starts with education. I put indoctrination there because actually that's what it is. Now, so many companies fail to do this. They miss the opportunity with new starters to really get across to them that passion, that connection, and the emotional content of what they do and why they're doing it. And what I say to companies is, look, you've got to indoctrinate these people. You've got to tell them about your history, your legacy, your reputation, and what the name stands for. Tell them about the product life cycle, where it fits in. Tell them about the environment and create this us versus the world, because that is the environment that is going to be more and more challenging in the decades that we have in front of us. Tell them about the internal customer relationship, what you do for others and vice versa. Importantly, critically important, is to tell them about the products and patients and what they do and the impact of things when they go wrong. And then get them to identify the quality habits, get them to own the habits that they need to adopt and apply on a day-to-day basis. Now, I mentioned earlier, ladies and gentlemen, the habit loop. This is really, really important, because when later in the session we talk about how do you modify and change behaviors, you've got to be asking yourself the question, what is the cue or trigger for that behavior? What is the routine that is then followed? And what is the reward that generates the behavior to be replicated or reproduced? So an example here that I certainly resonate with, my surname is Lush after all. You come home after a tough day in the office, it's maybe hot outside, it's maybe a bit early in the day, but you open the fridge and staring in front of you is a cold beer with the condensate dripping off the can. Now, for me, and I guess a few others, I hope, on the phone, that is the trigger for, instead of going for a cold glass of water, you pick up the can, you open it. The routine is you drink it, and the reward that you get is actually a dopamine fix. It's a feeling of relaxation. It's a feel-good feeling that then leads to the second can of beer. Okay, so that's the cue, the routine, and the reward. So, and I have done this, trust me, if you want to stop that fairly, you don't want that to become that's not a particularly healthy habit, you have to either remove the cue, in other words, don't buy the beer, replace or modify the routine, in other words, drink cold water instead of cold beer. You may not get the same reward. The reward is slightly different. Yeah, thanks, Brian. You said you're not alone. I feel relieved now. You get the same reward knowing that you're not necessarily addicted to the cold beer. Now, hunger, the cue for eating is you're hungry. No, it's not rocket science after all. You eat and you get that feeling of satisfaction that then drives you to repeat that process. Another interesting cue, just watch the next time you are in a bus queue, at a queue in an airport lounge, or you're sitting on a bus or train, you just watch what people do when they're just standing there. And I will put my mortgage on the behaviour will be, I'm standing here, that is the cue for getting their mobile phone out and instantly texting, which gives them that feeling of connection, the reward, which then drives that behavior. And that is that cue, routine, and reward. Now, at a pharmaceutical level, the cue in the workplace would be 5S. This, everything has a place and everything is in its place. The routine is driven by the shadow areas that every tool sits in that place, every piece of equipment is in the right place. And the reward is, because of less distraction, you have reduced levels of stress, but improvements in good manufacturing practice. Now, the importance of housekeeping and the importance of 5S is really underestimated in my opinion, because it is that cue that says to people, you're not outside in the general working environment anymore, you're back in a different environment, and this cue, the workplace looking really tidy, reminds them that the behaviors have to be different. Another example, ladies and gentlemen, the second one there, product release. We had a company a few years ago, one of our clients had a product recall. When they did a root cause investigation with our help, they realized that QPs were making release decisions, and any QPs on the line will identify with this. They were making the most important decisions, usually from 7 o'clock onwards in the evening, usually Thursday, Friday at the end of the week, when they literally had no choice but to go into product release and do the important job of releasing product. Unfortunately, as you guys who release product know, it's the most important decision you're going to ever make, and doing it at that time of day is not exactly conducive to good decision making because you're tired, you're fatigued, and you're stressed. Now, this company, once we talked them through on our in-house course on this subject about the cue, the routine, and the reward, they said, okay, Martin, you know what? The cue is never going to change. But what we can do is change the routine to drive a better practice. So what they did was they changed their production planning and product release system to allow QPs only to release product Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday between the hours of 9 in the morning and 12 in the afternoon. The reward was due dates were hit and better decisions were made, and they could sleep easier at night knowing they weren't going to face another product recall. So that is an example of, they They didn't discipline the QPs who released the product. They didn't complicate things by adding more check signatures to the batch record to give this false sense of security. They just said, look, let's change the behavior by changing the routine, and let's enforce that behavior by creating a system that actually drives it. Another example there, ladies and gentlemen, we all, for those of you involved and engaged with sterile product manufacture, we all know that whenever you go from a grade A area to a grade B area, vice versa, the automatic habit you expect operators to have is one of spraying their hands with sterile isopropyl alcohol in order to sanitize them. Now, unless that is habituated, in other words, done automatically without thinking, we can have serious problems with contamination incidents in the grade A. So what this company did was that they had a simple 3-step rule. They colored all of their IPA bottles red so that they were distinctive and visual. And on every laminar airflow cabinet, they had a red sign with the 3 rules very quickly summarized, so that the operators would, on exiting the grade A, they would be reminded by the red sign, the 3-step rule, directed to the red bottle, and the results they saw were a lot better. Finger dab failures were reduced, and that was the reward. Another example of the cue, routine, reward, habit loop is we did a session with one of our clients on how to improve their investigations and in doing so drive down repeat errors. So that was the reward they were looking for. Now the cue, we introduced a term called Goya, so that every time a deviation incident was raised, immediately Goya came to their mind, which in North Yorkshire, where I'm calling you from in the United Kingdom, that means get off your arse. That means go down immediately to the production floor to view it, to view the incident, talk to the people, and start a really good quality investigation. The routine, in other words, the ability to do that investigation in a systematic and disciplined way, was there for them in a template. And for those of you who participated in the last session on how to drive down repeat incidents, I showed you that template. So the template drove the behavior, and the reward was a reduction in repeat incidents. So whenever we're looking at a desired behavior, ladies and gentlemen, we've got to think about what is the behavior we want, what is the cue, what is the routine we want people to follow, and what reward will we give them that drives that habit time and time again. So the cue, just some reminder, cues are reminders, whether it be an immaculate plant, 5S, whether it be immaculate dress discipline. Things like this really matter, and certainly when I was in manufacturing at AstraZeneca, people used to say, Martin, why are you so hot on dress discipline? Is it such a big deal? Well, it is a big deal because it communicates to people instantly, immediately, and very visually that they've left their day life behind them and they are now operating in a pharmaceutical facility. Another cue or reminder is the role that shop floor supervisors play, in particular, leading by example, walking the talk, coaching, mentoring, and enforcing when needed. But also have constant messaging, whether it be poster campaigns, whether it be letterheads, whether it be whiteboards, but a messaging campaign that is constantly changing, but constantly getting the reminder across. Now, I'm going to give you some examples later of how to reduce documentation errors by using this process of the cue, the pattern or the routine, followed by the reward. So hopefully it'll become a little clearer. Now, last time you went to, whether it be Starbucks, not doing a free advertising campaign for them here, but it could be any one of the coffee houses. I was at a Starbucks coffee shop probably 3 months ago, And as many of you know that go to these places, it takes time for them to make the coffee. And usually when you're really desperate for that caffeine fix, the queue in front of you starts to irritate you. There was a particularly irate client in front, customer in front, and the way in which this customer was dealt with was really slick. And when I eventually got to the front of the queue, I said to the barista, I said, you handled that guy really well. He was clearly annoyed, but you handled him very well. How did you do that? And they said, well, it's our training. We have a routine that we have practiced that works, providing you do the basics. And they actually call it the latte routine. I thought that was quite clever. And they said the trigger, and these were the terms used by the barista, so they clearly understand how habits are formed. They said, well, Mr. Lush, the trigger is an annoyed customer. And we mentally follow the latte routine, which is to listen, acknowledge, take action, thank them, and explain what happened. And the reward is that they may not necessarily leave happy, but at least they leave. So this is an interesting example of a trigger and a simple routine that drives the reward. And the emphasis there is simple routine. Now, that routine, what's really, really important and where the pharmaceutical industry struggles is that the systems we have must drive the right behavior. For example, a 30-day closure time for deviations is insane. Okay, it's plainly wrong. That communicates deviations. Don't worry about them. They're not important. Driving down deviation incidents as a KPI is insane. It's wrong because that says problems are bad rather than problems are good. Let's learn from them. Complex SOPs and batch manufacturing records are wrong. Excessive check signatures dilute accountability. That's plainly wrong. Audits just led by QA are wrong. Complex change control procedures are wrong. Now, I'm going to get off my soapbox now because the point I'm making here is that often behaviours that we witness in the workplace are nothing to do with the individual, but everything to do with the systems that we have given them to operate. Now, one of my colleagues, Pete Goff, has been working with a client of ours who has a data integrity issue. Cut a long story short, inspectors found that this particular company had NIR for sampling and identity testing of active ingredients. This was placed in a sampling booth, and they then requested that operators drag 25 kilogram bags and lots of them into the sampling booth in order to do the requisite identity testing. And of course what the auditors found was that some operators were just dragging one bag in and doing all of the tests on one bag. Now you could say, well, yeah, but the operator should have known better, and there's some truth in that. But heck, wasn't that company making it really difficult? And when they said to us, well, what do you recommend we do? We said, get that IR on something mobile and create a system that allows you to take that to where the bag is to be sampled. And then you're not driving the wrong behavior. So often in our industry, we've got a situation where the systems are driving the wrong behavior. And there's no easy answer than, you know what, you're going to change those systems if you want to change those behaviors. The reward is really, really key because, we've got to constantly acknowledge, well done, you did well. You've got to constantly share best practice. Look at performance management targets that drive the right behavior, focusing very much on leading rather than lagging indicators. This is something that we don't do particularly well in our industry. We're often really good at the criticism bit, but when it comes to the reward and the acknowledgement of well done, we're often lacking in doing that. I don't think it's just our industry. I think it's just, in many cases, just human nature. But unless you get the reward, it doesn't encourage people to do the same thing again. Now, I'm going to give you just very quickly 7 simple steps to behaviour change, except the caveat is, look, it isn't quite this simple. Now, later on, I think in March, we have another session on changing workplace behaviours, and I'm going to elaborate on these as we go through. But having given you the big picture of, create the vision, create the emotional contact, understand then the habit loop, the trigger or cue, the routine, and then the reward, let's just boil that down to some 7 things that you can do or at least start to apply. Now, when you want to change a particular behavior, number 1 is identify the specific behavior you want to change. The more specific that behavior, the better. Number 2 then is about creating a compelling reason for doing so that is emotional, is impersonal and personal, and answers the question, what's in it for me, or what's in it for them, for actually changing that behavior. Unless you can create that compelling reason, why should they bother? Number 3 then is, for that existing behavior, you've got to isolate and understand the trigger, the routine, and the reward. So often we go into a troubleshooting situation when we've seen the products of a poor behavior. We're anxious, we're stressed, we tend to focus on the individual rather than the system, and therefore we don't take time often to identify the reasons why. When you want to change a behavior, just take a breath or 2, take a step back, and through very careful observation and very careful and sensitive questioning of those concerned, start to identify what triggers that particular behavior. What is the cue? What routine is then followed? And why do they continue to do it? In other words, what is the reward? Now, once you isolate and understand the reasons why, because most people want to do a decent job. They just want to do the best they can with what they've got. So they're not malicious in their intent. It's just the trigger, the routine, and the reward that drives that. So that's what we need to identify. Number 4 then is to say, well, okay, do we have any quick fixes? Can we engineer out or physically prevent that behavior? So an example would be one of our clients, they had a problem with a particular aseptic intervention, and despite training, despite education, operators who had been doing this intervention for years were continuing to do it for all of the reasons that we've just described. Well, all they did was to put a clear perspex screen in front of the place that intervention normally took place. So they physically prevented the person doing the intervention. And after 6 months, they then removed the screen, by which time that old habit had been replaced by a stronger one. Remember, you can never break the old habits, just replace them with a stronger habit. You can remove the trigger, the beer, or you can replace the routine, drink the water instead of the beer. So always look at those quick fixes. Now, once you've identified the habit to be changed, you've really, really analyzed it. You've looked for the quick fixes. Number 5 then is about breaking down the key steps of the new behavior. And I call it the 6 to fix, because it's got to be quick, it's got to be simple, because quick and simple equals easy to habituate or form habits. We then minimize the distractions in the way we demonstrate those new habits. And this is where number 7 comes in, the dedicated practice, feedback, practice. This is when it's a bit like, your first driving lesson, eventually through practice and practice and practice, where you're constantly breaking down the skills that are required and focusing on them at the next session. This is where those habits begin to form through that very dedicated practice, feedback, practice. And that's something we're going to examine later on in May. Now, if you contrast number 7 with the very typical approach that many companies take, which is to rush in an SOP, rush in a new procedure, rush in a new practice, without having done number 7, and then they realize that people are just following or doing what they did before, for the simple reasons the habits have not formed, the new habits at least. So let's just finish off in the last few minutes just to give you an example of how to use this process in minimizing omission errors in documentation. So we're going to look at each one of the, okay, what are the cues? How do we drive the right behavior through the structure of the document, through the physical location to make it easier, and how do we then go through effective training to create that habit? Now, this is just a re-emphasis of, well, what is an attention cue or trigger? Well, it's any label or device or mechanism that gets your attention immediately. It could be, that seatbelt sign, you get into the car, you don't plug your seatbelt in, and it starts beeping at you. It could be signage in the middle there, or it could be, as you see on the right, a very obvious visible cue. Now, what we know in order of priority for the brain, these are the cues that the brain prefers: sound, motion or change in pattern, color, shape or text, and also smell, but we won't go there on that one. Now, in terms of documentation and driving a change in behavior to reduce omission errors, these are the attention cues that are very visual in documentation. 4 factors impact our visual attention: the area of interest, that's where it's located; how much information stands out from the environment; how much effort is required in getting that information; and expediency, in other words, how often something expected actually happens. So, if you look at this as a bad example, the area of interest, the physical location where the information can be found, in this example, it's hidden. When we gather the information, we have an average scan time is about 1/3 of a second. So the harder it is, the least likely it is to take place. If you contrast that, ladies and gentlemen, with this type of design document, where you have basic data easily accessible, you have triggers that or cues through color and pictures, you have alignment to signatures. So you can see how the trigger or cue, the color or positioning or pictures, followed by a very simple routine in the way the document is laid out, leading to the reward, which is procedural compliance, all kicks in. Now, let's just move on. I hope, ladies and gentlemen, that I've given you a flavour of what is possible here. Any questions you have, Brigitte, you sent in a question around QA audits. I'll respond to you later on, but I'll answer any questions that you send in, ladies and gentlemen. And if you really want to know more about this fascinating subject, we run a lot of in-house customized workshops that are proving to be very successful through their customization on how to change quality habits and culture. These are customized to meet your needs. And really what I'd like to do is to really encourage you to spread the word, share our passion with this, because as Janet Woodcock said right at the beginning there, our industry needs to change, and it needs to change quickly. And the only way that change is going to happen is through people changing their quality habits. Because at the end of the day, quality habits are our true north. We become what we repeatedly do. So when we talk about culture change, what we should really be talking about is habit change. And I hope that knowledge of where habits come from, how they are formed, the reality of if you want to change a behavior, you first observe that behavior, observe the cue, observe the routine, and then look at the reward, and then change that habit by adjusting any one of those. So thanks ever so much, everyone, for listening in. I hope you found it very, very interesting. Please, if you've got any more questions, I promise you I'll get back to you with some answers, either by email or phone. And lastly, can you please feed back to me what you think of the webinar? We take your feedback very, very importantly, because we adjust and we improve as a result of that. So thanks very much, everyone. For those of you where it's late in the evening, you can go to that fridge now, pick up that cold beer, Unfortunately for Brian and I, it's a little too early. Thanks very much, everyone. Bye-bye.